Today, I would like to take some time to reacquaint the world with the biblical view of marriage. Let's begin with terminology. There's no single biblical view of marriage, and in fact, there's not a single word in the Bible that corresponds to the English word marriage as we know it. How do we know then that something like a marriage took place? In most cases, men are the subjects and women are the objects of transactions that constitute a marriage. When the Holy Bible describes men taking, giving, and bringing women and other goods to create, mediate, and strengthen alliances among men, that's when we know. The words typically translated as husband and wife are generally used elsewhere in the Bible to simply refer to a man and a woman. Adam and Eve, who are usually understood to be the first examples of a marriage, never actually got married in the Bible, and the word wife here is actually just a woman. In Genesis 3:16, God explicitly says to the woman that her man will rule over her. At that moment, man then names the woman, reducing her to the status of cattle, which serves as a functional utility in relation to a man. The most common Hebrew term for a family or household literally translates to the house of the father. There are also two additional words that are sometimes translated in English as husband, Baal and Adon. So when translators use words like marriage and husband, they are doing so to suppress the language of male rule, since these are the same words used to describe relations between a master and a slave, and the relations between deities and their worshippers. Here are some examples. Didn't you ever wonder why in traditional wedding ceremonies the bride's father would walk his daughter down the aisle towards the groom, only to be met with the question, who gives this woman to be married to this man? Or even before that day, why a man traditionally asks a woman's father for permission to marry his daughter? Because women were considered the property of men. The exchange of daughters alongside animals and other properties served to establish alliances and obligations between kinship groups. This is quite apparent when you examine the 9th and the 10th commandments, when you see a wife grouped alongside an ox and a slave. In short, biblical marriage meant male ownership of women who existed solely for sexual pleasure and productivity. Upon marriage, a woman's property and her body became the possession of her new husband. As the head of the household, men, usually between the ages of 18 and 24, had nearly unlimited rights over wives and children. A woman became available for men's possession soon after she reached puberty, usually between 11 and 13 years old, because that is when she became physically able to produce children. The family was crucial to the ancient world, and the marital obligation of sexual intercourse was best understood in agricultural terms, with the male being the sower of the seed, and the female as the field in which the seed is transformed and from which it is brought forth. In the patriarchal economy, a woman's value is determined by her productivity, her fertility, her fieldship. So you can imagine that one of the worst misfortunes that could bestow upon a woman was barrenness. A woman who could not conceive was socially stigmatized as not truly a woman at all, and was likely suspected of being a grave sinner to have warranted such a punishment by God. As with fields, men can increase their holdings with women. A man can accumulate many fields, but the field can only have one owner, and he must recognize the proprietal rights of other men over their fields. This is known as polygyny, many women, rather than polygamy, many spouses. To ensure that any offspring were the legitimate heirs, women were restricted to just one sex partner, her husband. However, the husband maintained the right to have multiple sex partners, wives, concubines, war booties, sexual slaves, and even prostitutes. And not all acquired women share the same status. Some of the women who have been translated to concubine derive from the Latin term that was used to refer to individuals in a Roman system of non-marital but recognized friends with benefits sexual relationships, both the opposite sex and same sex. But this may not be a perfect translation, for it could also refer to a wife of secondary rank. Acquiring wives, concubines, and siring sons reflected power and prestige. A man's sexual potency and his political power were often interrelated. We see this illustrated in the story of King David. During the period of political and military struggle between David and the house of Saul, after his death of course, 2 Samuel states David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. The narrator immediately follows this political comment by indicating that David had 6 sons by 6 different wives. That is to say, the multiplication of wives and sons to David is understood to correspond to and even demonstrate symbolically his increasing military strength. In today's culture, of course, numerous sexual conquests can increase a young man's prestige in the eyes of other men. Conversely, the consequences of sexual activity with multiple partners are usually quite different for a woman's reputation and status. A man who is good at being a man, so far as acquiring wives and siring sons is concerned, will probably be a capable military figure and will garner prestige and support from other Israelite men. Perhaps this is the reason why we see the families of candidates during political campaigns in the United States, because Americans want to see that everything works. David's son Absalom engaged in public sex with his father's concubines to shame David's manliness, and in turn his political power in order to earn respect in the eyes of his fellow male Israelites. Absalom hoped to demonstrate that by the king's inability to control sexual access to the women of David's household, that he's not good at being a man, and hence not good at being a king either. Such a demonstration amounts to a kind of a symbolic castration. These types of sexual politics are frequent throughout the first and second books of Samuel, and we even find a commentary on political impotence at the beginning of 1 Kings. When David was advanced in years, he fails to have sex with a virgin. Rape and adultery were considered crimes against the men, not the women. If a man raped a virgin, he was required to marry her, since her father would now have a difficult time finding her a suitable husband. A women's consent meant nothing in the biblical world. Virginity was seen as purity and subsequently valuable. It's not unheard of for newlyweds to be accompanied into the wedding chamber by their parents to witness proof of the bride's virginity upon consummation. In fact, marriages weren't considered valid until the act of consummation took place. Sex is to marriage as water is to baptism. Ever wonder why we clean glasses at wedding receptions to get the newlyweds to kiss? Because historically, the act of consummation took place immediately following the ceremony, while the guest waited in the other parts of the house. To give the couple privacy, the partygoers would clang and bang on pots and pans while the couple banged in the bedroom. The offense of adultery is against the man who is supposed to have authority over the offended woman's sexuality, be it her husband or her father. If the adulterous man is married himself, the offense is not against his own wife. The theme of adultery is a common one in prophetic literature. The book of Hosea describes God as a husband who struggles to retain control over his wife Israel. The image of a woman's free sexuality is used to describe the effects of apostasy and rebellion. Sexual violence is used against women to signify divine punishment of a faithless Israel. Feminists hate this book. If a married man had sexual relations with an unmarried prostitute, there is no indication in the Hebrew Bible that he had committed adultery, even though he himself is married. Adultery violates a man's right to have exclusive sexual access to his woman, but it does not violate a woman's right to have exclusive sexual access to her husband. In regards to prostitution, although it was a shameful and stigmatized occupation for women, it was tolerated in ancient Israel. Women who had no father, husband, or other male relative to take care of them in the patriarchal societies of the ancient Near East may have had few other options for survival. Intermarriage, that is, marriage between Jews and Gentiles, was against Mosaic law, but not always followed. The prohibition on marrying a non-Jew had less to do with race, but more out of fear of idolatry and cultural contamination. What we see happen with King Solomon after he marries the foreign women. Now, you all might be wondering what Jesus had to say about marriage. Not a whole lot, although he did use marital imagery and parables every now and then. He, of course, attended a wedding feast, but he couldn't get through it without having to make more wine. Conservatives like to point to this story in the Gospel of John as proof that Jesus approved solely of heterosexual weddings since he attended one. When asked about divorce, which is a word that literally means to let go of, again, think property rights here, Jesus says not to do it except in the case of porneia, which refers to sexual immorality. And finally, in attempting to resolve some questions surrounding reunification with spouses after death, Jesus says the point is moot, since in the afterlife we are like angels and therefore marriage no longer exists. Since there's no longer a need for procreation, there's no longer a need for marriage. And so the institution of marriage, which in Jesus' cultural context was primarily understood as property right, is abolished. Now, for the homosexuals that may be watching, I will now talk about some biblical stories about alternative families that you might find fascinating. In the book of Ruth, Naomi leaves Bethlehem as the wife of a man and the mother of 2 sons, but returns as a woman who has been joined by another woman, who cleaves to her with a solemn declaration, "Before the Lord, nothing will part me from you." At the beginning of the book's first chapter, Naomi reflects a family under traditional patriarchal norms, but by the close of the first chapter finds a situation that is unique in the entire Hebrew Bible, a close relationship between 2 women. When Ruth clings or cleaves to her mother-in-law, it echoes Genesis chapter 2:24, designating the passionate embrace of a male and female in creation. 2 verses later, there's a proclamation by Ruth that is often used today as part of sacred vows at wedding ceremonies. There is nothing here to prevent the reader from speculating that the two became one. When the women return to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem, they are forced to find a way to shelter their love within the patriarchal confines of Judean society. So through the direction of Naomi, Ruth seduces Boaz, becomes pregnant, and thus marries him, ensuring economic stability. In the homosexual lingo, you could say Boaz serves as Ruth's beard. When Boaz and Ruth's child is born, the village women rejoice not at a son being born to Boaz, but a son being given to Naomi. Naomi literally takes the child from Ruth and lays him in her own lap, while the women of Bethlehem proclaim, Naomi has a son. So not only was Boaz the economic provider and beard to these women, but also the sperm donor to allow this lesbian couple to have a child. Love is never mentioned between Boaz and Ruth, but there is jubilation among the women of Bethlehem when they talk of Ruth's devotion or love for Naomi. The story of Ruth not only ranks as the earliest, but also one of the most beautiful depictions of female same-sex love in the Bible. Although you may not agree with this interpretation, you must at the very least recognize that the family dynamics of these two women alongside Boaz is a queer one that is out of the ordinary. It's also interesting to point out that Ruth and Naomi's son is a distant ancestor to Jesus Christ, who likewise is born into an alternative situation. The infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke say that Mary and Joseph were betrothed, that is, engaged or promised to be married. When Joseph discovered that Mary was pregnant, Jewish law would have demanded her execution for having shamed him by committing adultery. She was pregnant with someone else's child. In society's eyes, she was a grave sinner. He planned to leave her quietly so that this fate would not befall upon her, but chose not to after an encounter with God. In other words, his prayerful conscience allowed him to defy church teaching. Had Joseph been caught up in the traditional Orthodox interpretation and practice of Jewish law, Mary and her unborn child would have been put to death. The Gospel of Matthew describes Joseph as a righteous man, and in this case, righteousness was adhering to compassion over the law. And through this compassion, Christ was made manifest. Roman Catholic tradition goes on to say that Joseph never had marital relations with Mary, which would have been very countercultural since the primary purpose of marriage was procreation. This not only would have been against the so-called natural function of marriage, but also traditional gender roles of a husband and wife. In addition, it's worth mentioning that male-female genital activity does not bring Christ into this world, but the actions of an alternative family. A third alternative family story that takes place later in the New Testament, again in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, was when Jesus is approached by a Roman centurion who asks him to heal his servant. The Greek word Matthew uses here for the servant is pais, a term regularly used in Hellenistic literature to designate the younger beloved of same-sex love. The fact that a Roman in this scene pleads to a Jew would have been seen as unconventional, since as a soldier his role was to rule, control, and dominate. This gives us character insight into how little the centurion regarded social norms. Jesus' response is interesting, explaining that in all of Israel he has not seen such faithfulness. Now at first glance, this response can easily be interpreted as Jesus approving of the soldier's faith in Jesus Christ to heal the servant. But why not suggest that Jesus' reply may have actually been about the soldier's faithfulness to his slave, remarking on a love for a beloved that risks humiliation and danger to restore the beloved to wholeness. I can certainly see Jesus relating to love in that manner. Culturally, since marrying was forbidden while serving in the military, warriors were often accompanied by younger male companions who shared in their adventures and dangers of their lovers. Similar accounts of love between older and younger warriors are found in later stories of classical Greece, flower warriors in Korea, and samurai love in Japan. In this story, Jesus appears to approve of a love that includes unswerving loyalty and care of lovers for their beloveds. He did not shun someone who possibly may have been a homosexual believer, but instead affirmed and aided him. It's not without a sense of irony that each time Roman Catholics go up to the altar to receive the Holy Eucharist, an act that is forbidden for homosexuals to participate in, they recite the words, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, but only say the word and my soul will be healed." Ironic because these are the words the gay centurion spoke to Jesus. Could this be subliminal messaging of the homosexual agenda? In conclusion, it's interesting that it's these three alternative family stories, not the heterosexual ones, that best reflect the love and nurturing component that we think of today when it comes to biblical marriage. Perhaps we were just ahead of our time. I mean, the homosexuals were, alternative families were ahead of the time. I am clearly not gay.